Okay, so Amos chapter 8. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick it up kind of in the middle of the chapter at verse 4, and I'm going to read through verse 10 to get us started. And I just ask that you keep your Bibles open before you as we go along here. This is how it begins in verse 4. Hear this, you who trample the needy and do away with the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath ended that we may market wheat, skimping on the measure, boosting the price, and cheating with dishonest scales, buying the poor with silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, selling even the sweepings with the wheat. The Lord has sworn by himself, the pride of Jacob, I will never forget anything they have done. Will not the land tremble for this, and all who live in it mourn? The whole land will rise like the Nile. It will be stirred up and then sink like the river of Egypt. In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your religious festivals into mourning and all your singing into weeping. I will make all of you wear sackcloth and shave your heads. I will make that time like mourning for an only son, and the end of it like a bitter day. That's as far as we're going to read for right now. As we get into this, just a couple of observations. I want you to see this. The first is just really a simple point that not only in this passage, but as a book, the whole book, the book of Amos, its main concern is the concern of justice. And in this particular passage, you don't see that word justice, but if you were to read the entire book, and some of you have done that this past week, if you were to see this entire book, you'll see that justice is right at the center. And here's what I'll do. Just want to put some scripture passages here on the screen that kind of get at that, and I'll just start with this one from Amos chapter 2. You'll see some of the very same language that we see here. They sell the innocent for silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals. See how that matches with verse 6? They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground and deny justice to the oppressed. See how the concern here? It's about justice, good and bad, right and wrong, justice. Chapter 5, verse 12 says this, there are those who oppress the innocent and take bribes and deprive the poor of justice in the courts. So at that time, here's the situation. There are those who are poor, and the whole society is set up in a way so that they cannot get a fair shake. When they've been aggrieved, when something has been done to them that's wrong, when they've been cheated, they can't even go to the courts to seek a righting of the wrong there. They're denied, they're deprived of justice even in that situation. Probably the most famous passage in all of the book of Amos is chapter 5, verses 21 through 24. I've just put a portion of it on the screen. You may want to just turn back there. I'm going to read all of verses 21 through 24. I want you to get a sense of what this passage is all about. I want you to feel it somehow. This is how it goes. God says, beginning in verse 21, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness like a never-failing stream. Martin Luther King Jr. actually made that last line very famous in the United States. Let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness like never-failing stream. Here's what's going on. So in Israel at the time, this is a situation. It's a very economically prosperous time. There are those who are really doing well, but they're doing well on the back of those who are not doing so well. There are the poor who are being shut out. They're being deprived of justice. All kinds of wrong are being done to them. And those who are doing the wrong are showing up on Sundays and lifting their hands up and singing, oh, God, you're an awesome God. We love you. Thank you so much. And I think I get it right. when I think this is the meaning, God says to them, shut up. I hate it when you worship me. I wish you just shut it down. When you come and worship me, it's a stench. It stinks. It smells. Be quiet. It'd be better if you didn't come here and sing at all. How can you, in your everyday life, just go about, treating the poor badly and yet come in here and sing praises to me? Shut up. I mean, by the way, Amos had a ministry where he did not hold back. It's about justice. And by now you've caught the particular flavor of justice. The issue at hand is this. The rich are depriving the poor. There's an inequity, a disparity between the two, and they're making it worse. And we're not used to thinking about justice in these terms. I realize that. I think today, when we think about rich and poor, we think in terms of charity. And if someone is not being charitable, we call them stingy or maybe even a Scrooge, but we don't put it in terms of good and bad, right and wrong. We don't put it in terms of justice. So let's just kind of dial back everything, and I want to just talk through this, and let's see if we can kind of try to understand where Amos is coming from. Okay, if you come here every once in a while, you know that I make funny drawings, and this is my attempt to do it. Suppose that two babies are born on the same day. Okay, so moms go to the hospital or to wherever, and baby arrives. As it arrives, takes in its first gasp of air and lets out its first cry. There are two, and maybe it's helpful if you just think of yourself as one of these two. So right now, maybe you can just think of your birth date. Mine is July 10th, 1976, in case any of you would later want to get me any birthday gifts on that day. But for now, just you think of your own date of your birth. And here's how it happens. As life goes by, everybody gets, they kind of head down the track of life, 70, 80 years. And you know how life is. When babies are born, when they take their first breath and let out their first cry, they're born into all variety of situations. And so it may be, as we think about the track of life, that one child, when it's born as an infant, it's surrounded by a family that's a support system. It's surrounded by resources, wealth perhaps, a stable home where values and principles are taught that are going to serve this child well. There's all kinds of ways in which educationally or with health, certain children, when they let out their first cry, that support system is all around them, right? And then, of course, we're aware of the fact that other babies, when they take their first breath and let out their first cry, they don't have a stable family around them. Sometimes they're surrounded by chaos from the moment they come into this world. And there's not a support system that includes money and resources. Oftentimes there's not access to education or health. I mean, we realize that through no fault of any children that take their first breath and let out their first cry, there's an inequitable distribution of resources, right? And probably it would be best if you didn't only think about here in the United States. I mean, realize that around the world, there are children who every day are and letting out a cry. And as you just think about it, through no fault of their own, merit, good or bad, there's all variety of different distributions as to what surrounds that infant when they're born. Does that make sense? All right, as life goes forward, you can almost guess what's going to happen to the child who's born with the wealth of resources around them and the child that's not. And often this is the pattern we see. That child that's born into a family, like my family, my kids, they have a stable home. They have a mom and dad who love them. There's resources, education, principles that we're teaching them. My children, I think, have a very good chance at some point, feeling a sense of kind of blessing and wealth and riches in life. There are other children, though, and you can almost see it right from the start. It's going to go a different way, so that at some point, those on the top are going to say to them, I'm rich. I've really been blessed in life. And other children are just going to say this, help, right? I mean, sometimes we make choices and that, but often it just right from the very beginning. Now, strip away everything else. Two people born on the same day are kind of walking down the track of life. And at some point, these two people who took their first breath and let out their first cry are maybe going to look each other in the eye. Their lives will cross. They'll look at each other in the eye. I would say there's some very common sense ways in which the first child and the second child should respond to each other. Wouldn't you? Just some common sense ways, stripping everything else aside. Now, since we're talking about justice, let me say this. Low-level injustice. You may not believe this, but believe it or not, there are some people who I would say it this way, they live in a kind of bubble. And in this bubble, they have insulated themselves from hearing the cries for help. Sometimes they're just unaware, like, I didn't even know there was anyone out there who didn't have it like I had it. Sometimes, believe it or not, that being unaware is willful. Like, every time someone does cry out for help, our defenses go up, right? Believe it or not, and by the way, I mean, I can't make this point without saying this, most of us who live here in the United States live in that bubble. I mean, we're kind of mildly aware that in other places, in other countries, there are people who are living in grinding poverty on less than $2 a day, who have no access to even clean water. But we do our best on a day-to-day basis to just kind of section that off so we can live our lives, right? I would say that's sort of really low-level injustice. Just, we kind of live in a bubble, we're insulated from hearing it. I would say there's kind of a second level. What makes justice more terrible. And it goes something like this, where the person who's been rich and blessed, that person says to themselves, well, really, I deserve this. I was given these talents, I've worked hard, I've pulled myself up by my bootstraps, and the reason for this gap, this disparity between me and that other person is because I have done things right and they have done things wrong, and it's my effort, it's my talents, it's me. And never mind, by the way, what God says as an example in Deuteronomy chapter 8. As the Israelites were heading into the promised land, God says, okay, you're going to be moving into houses that you didn't build. You're going to be eating fruit from vineyards you didn't plant. He says, I want you to remember something. This is what he says. You may say to yourself at that time, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember that the Lord your God gives you the ability to produce wealth and so confirms his covenant. So in other words, you may say, well, I was talented and I worked really hard. Oh, where'd you get that talent? Right? Where'd you get the idea to work hard? You were surrounded by a family and, there was an inequitable distribution. Don't say to yourself, I've done it. I mean, it's one thing to just be in a bubble. It's another to say, well, the bubble's burst. I know there are people out there who are worse off than me, but it's their fault and I'm here because I'm so great. Kind of a second level. I would say there's even a third level. Something even worse. And that is when the person who's on the top, they say to themselves, not only do I deserve it, and they don't, not only is that the case, but I need more. And the way I'm going to get it is off their backs. That actually is the situation here in the book of Amos. I want you to look again with me in chapter 8. In the middle of verse 5, here's what's happening. They're gathered together for worship. And as they're worshiping, it's like they're looking at their watches because they're saying, when will this worship service be over? I mean, we're here, we're praising you, God, but I got things to do. I'm rich, yes, but I need to get even richer. And here's how. It says, skimping on the measure, boosting the price, cheating with dishonest scales, buying the poor with silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, selling even the sweepings with the wheat. Here's the situation. Those who are rich, those who are blessed, they need even more. And so when those who are poor come to buy for them, You cheat them with dishonest scales. They weigh out the food, and you've got the wrong measurements on there, and so you get even more money for them. They find themselves hard up, out of luck, and you say, I'll tell you what, why don't you go into debt? Sure, take these pair of sandals, but then you're going to owe me, and you charge excessive interest. Or even this one, selling even the sweepings with the wheat. There are people who are so hungry they have to buy food. So when they come to buy food, when you have the wheat sitting there, you put the sweepings in too, so that when it weighs even more. And they have to pay, or else they'll go hungry. And those who are at the top, who are rich, who are blessed, say, you know what, this isn't enough. I deserve it so much, I need even more, and I'll get it off the back of those who are in much less circumstances. You see, like just being unaware in the bubble, that's one thing. It's another thing to kind of say, well, I deserve it. I've earned it. It's my talent. It's my hard work, and they deserve to be where they're at. It's kind of a third level to say, not only do I deserve it, I'm going to look this person in the eye. I'm going to get more from you, even though you have way less. There's a fourth level. Just egregious. And this is it. When those people who are cheating those who have far less, they kind of make it a religion. They kind of put religious externals to it, and they say things like this, well, God is with me. He wants me to be wealthy. He wants me to be rich. And the reason they're not is they're heathen and they're pagan, and I'm right with God and they're not. And so let's gather together for worship and lift up our hands because, God, you've been so good to me. And those poor heathen people, they deserve what they get. Let them go to hell. See how terrible that is? See how terrible that is? All right, that's the first point. There's an issue of justice here. Here's the second point. In this case, this issue of justice is related to your understanding of grace. And those who are cheating the poor, who aren't helping them, who aren't doing what just common sense would say, this would be what the Bible would say. Not only do you not understand grace, not only have you not received God's grace, but you scorn it. And that's really the second point I want to make. And let me make that point by just talking about the general arc of the Bible. So, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 26, Moses, when they're entering the promised land, he says, okay, you're going to enter and live in homes you didn't build. You're going to own vineyards you didn't plant. You're going to become wealthy at some point. When you gather together for worship, you're going to bring an offering. When you stand up to give that offering, there are words that I want you to say. These are the words. My father was a wandering Aramean. This, by the way, was true of any Israelite. Their ancestors were Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They were nomads. They had no place to live. They had moved from a country to a place that God said to go to. They were foreigners there. They had no place to lay their heads. They were always in danger, always on the road, in trouble. And now people are settled down. They're wealthy. They're in homes. When they bring their offering, they're supposed to say, my father was a wandering Aramean. Maybe it'd be helpful if let's say that together today. Ready? My father was a wandering Aramean. Not that I deserve this. Not that I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. God's been really gracious. My fathers had nothing. They were nomads. My father was a wandering Aramean. In the fourth commandment, which, by the way, is a commandment about worship, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy, 6 days, you should labor and do all your work. The seventh day, that's a day for God. There's a ground given for that commandment in Deuteronomy chapter 5. This is the ground. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Okay, when you gather together for worship, you've just got to remember this. You were slaves in Egypt. I don't know if you know this, but when the Israelites celebrated the Passover, one of the lines in their celebration was something like this. We were once slaves in Egypt. Maybe it'd be helpful if we just said that line together, right? We were once slaves in Egypt. I remember that my father was a wandering nomad. I remember at one point I was enslaved, I was oppressed, I cried out for help. God answered my prayer, He delivered me, He set me free, but that's who I am. We were once slaves in Egypt. And as we think about the whole arc of the story of the Bible, maybe even this passage from the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul is talking to the church. He says this, "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins." The wrath of God was on you. You were His enemy. You had rebelled. You were dead. You were as good as dead. You were dead in your transgressions and sins. But then the passage goes on to describe God's incredible grace. How Jesus came and bore the brunt of, the judgment that was on you so He could take it away. And it's by grace you've been saved through faith in Jesus Christ, His death and resurrection, and we've been set free. But, let's not think more highly of ourselves than we ought. I was once dead in transgressions and sins. Maybe we should say that together. I was once dead in my transgressions and sins. Think about it. My father was a wandering nomad. I was a slave. I was dead. That's who we are. But God was gracious. When we cried out for help, He came to save us. And I don't know if you know this, but Jesus, who was just a brilliant teacher, at one point, he told this parable about how it was going to be on the final judgment day. He says all the people would be gathered before the throne of God. And God is going to separate us like sheep and goats. Jesus says He's going to put all the sheep on one side, the right hand, and all the goats on the left. And He's going to say to the sheep, "Welcome into my kingdom, into everlasting blessedness and peace." And He's going to say to the goats, "Depart, I never knew you." And those who are sheep are going to say, why? And there's this list, and I just want to put it on the screen. This is what Jesus says. He says to the sheep, "You know what? I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I was naked, you clothed me. I was sick, and I was in prison, and you came to visit me." And then they're going to say, "Well, when did we do these things?" He says, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you did to me." Then the goats, Jesus says, are going to say, "Jesus, Lord, when did we see you hungry and not feed you? When did we see you thirsty and not give you a drink? When did we see you a stranger and not invite you in? When did we see you naked and not clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and we didn't come to visit you?" And Jesus will say, "Whatever you did not do for the least of these, you did not do for me. Depart from me, I never knew you." Now, I want to be clear about this because I don't want you to get the wrong idea. I'm not saying, that scripture passage is not saying the way to earn God's grace or the way to earn His love is by feeding a hungry person, giving a drink to a thirsty person, by clothing a naked person. It's not what it's saying. It's saying this: if we are recipients of God's grace, if our father was a wandering error man, if we were once slaves, if we were dead in our trespasses and sins, and we cried out, "God, help us," and He showed up and helped us, then when we hear someone crying help, we'll automatically know what to do, right? So, first point, the book of Amos is about justice. Second point, this particular problem with justice, the rich oppressing the poor, it's ultimately a failure to understand and to receive grace. And this problem exists. It proves that the person with which it exists scorns the grace of God. Okay, third point. This is really the important one. Third point, God has a solution. And I want you to see what the solution is. Look with me beginning in verse 9. Amos points this out. There's a day coming. In fact, the day of the Lord, that phrase, the day of the Lord, is a really big phrase in the minor prophets. And Amos, since he's the earliest of them, is the first to use it. And what happens is these prophets, they see the problems. There's sort of this external religiosity, but the hearts on the inside are just black and corrupt, and things are not going well. And this is what Israel has become. I mean, they're worshiping God, and God's like, would you just shut up? And this day is coming, though. There is a day coming where God is going to set it all straight. I mean, the world's messed up now, but God's going to do something on that day. So, verse 9. In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I'll make the sun go down at noon. I'll darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your religious festivals into mourning and all your singing into weeping. I will make all of you wear sackcloth and shave your heads. I will make that time like mourning for an only son and the end of it like a bitter day. God is saying something like this. You even see it in verse 7. I will never forget anything they have done. You've cheated someone. You've taken advantage of someone. You've neglected them. You've deprived them of justice. I will never forget it. And I will judge you. I will punish you. I will set things straight. And by the way, I mean, if you take the time to read this book, there's no words that I can say now that would overemphasize the kind of judgment that God promises, the kind of anger that he has. I mean, would you stop worshiping? Would you shut up? I am going to destroy you. Don't you understand that? And by the way, while I make this point, this stuff really preaches, doesn't it? The reason I say that is, I mean, the silence right now is so loud. I mean, most of us who walk into these doors today, all of us probably, we'd put ourselves in the category of those, you know what, we've been really rich and blessed. And man, we start reading something like this, and it's sort of, be quiet, be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. And the judgment that is coming for this, Amos just makes it very plain. I couldn't even put into words what he says here. It is coming. Okay, that's the first part of God's solution. Here's the second part. I want you to turn with me to chapter 9, beginning in verse 11. There's this coming day, and God's going to do something. When the day comes, he's going to set it straight. I mean, it's broken now, but he's going to fix it. And we read about that in chapter 8. Now in chapter 9, in that day, I'm beginning in verse 11, in that day, I will restore David's fallen shelter. I will repair its broken walls and restore its ruins, and will rebuild it as it used to be, so that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations that bear my name, declares the Lord, who will do these things. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when the reaper will be overtaken by the plowman and the planter by the one treading grapes. New wine will drip from the mountains and flow from all the hills, and I will bring my people, Israel, back from exile. So God has promised judgment and punishment, but at the same time, in that same day, he promises hope and restoration. And let's just take a little time to talk this through. In verse 11, there's a promise that David's fallen shelter will be repaired. Now, David was the great king of Israel. And Israel's purpose was to put God's grace on display, right? Their fathers were wandering Arameans. They were nomads. Their fathers were slaves. They cried out for help, and they got God's grace. Their job was to put that grace on display for the world, but they're broken. They're not doing it. They're just as bad as all the rest of the nations. But God says, I'm going to do something. It's going to start with David. I'm going to send you this new king, and I'm going to restore this whole thing. And by the way, since we're entering into Christmas season, we're kind of leaning forward or pressing forward to the coming of Jesus. 750 years before Jesus ever showed up on the scene, Amos is already looking forward to the day of his coming, where in Bethlehem, in the town of David, a new baby who would be born, who would bring peace and restore David's fallen household. That's here in the book of Amos. Second observation that I want to make, verse 12, it begins to make this clear, and the book does as well. Whereas in the Old Testament, it's just one nation, the Israelites. All the nations belong to God. All the nations belong to God. And when David's fallen house is restored, all the nations are going to be included. Third point, it's going to be a restoration of the entire world. I want you to look with me at verse 13. It says, "The days are coming when the reaper will be overtaken by the plowman, when the planter by the one treading grapes. New wine will drip from the mountains and flow from all the hills. I'll bring my people Israel back from exile." So these days coming in that day, where all of these inequities, all these disparities are going to be washed away. Here's why. The reaper will be overtaken by the plowman, the planter by the one treading grapes. Now, this is kind of an agricultural image, so it may be lost on some of us, but here's the idea. There are seasons when you plow, when you plant, and when you harvest, right? And what this passage says is that these seasons are going to overtake one another. So generally in the spring, you plant, then you have to wait a long, long time till the fall when you harvest, but then you have to wait a long, long time till you plant again. And what he's saying is, listen, after you plant, you're going to reap a harvest so much, you're still going to be picking that harvest when it's time for the planter to do his job again. There's going to be so much food that that person's going to be kind of crawling up your back. And when that planter goes to do his work, the reaper's still going to be working, and the planter's still going to, there's going to be so much food, so much abundance that we won't have this anymore. Everyone will be taken care of. And we don't have any fields this fertile now. The promise is that when this Davidic king comes, the whole world, with all its brokenness, where there's all this inequity, it's going to be solved, fixed. Now, you may be asking this question, well, how do those two go together? On the one hand, there's a strong statement of justice. I am going to get you. I will not forget. And on the other hand, there's this word of hope. There's a day coming where the world will be fixed and everything will be put back together. And by the way, all the nations will be included. How do those two go together? And as we press and lean forward to Christmas, let me suggest this. It comes together in Jesus. I mean, as you look at this, don't you realize who Jesus is? The God of the universe who plunged his riches into our poverty. I mean, you know who he is, right? The God of heaven who was born where? Placed where? In a feeding trough? To what kind of parents? Rich parents or poor? You know that he was one who came and was a nomad. He said of himself, I have no place to lay my head. The God of heaven, who had all the riches, plunged himself into our poverty. And while we're speaking about justice and injustice, don't you realize that every injustice that could be done to a person was done to him? I mean, think of his trial. The most unjust trial ever, probably. I mean, it didn't happen in the daytime. It didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened at night in someone's home. The witnesses that were called forward were false witnesses. The judges, when they rendered their sentences, said, he's innocent, and yet he was condemned to die. Every injustice that can be done to someone was done to Jesus. Don't you realize who he is? I mean, this statement here, verse 9, in that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I want you to think about this phrase. People are going to ask Jesus, when did we see you thirsty? When did we see you a stranger? When did we see you naked? When did we see you imprisoned? Don't you know the answer? On the cross, as Jesus hung there, imprisoned, naked, his final words, I'm thirsty. Every injustice that can be done to someone was done to Jesus. And you know why, right? Because God needed to set everything straight. He promised, I will punish, I will not forget. And here's what happened on the cross. All of our guilt, all of our sin, all the reasons that we ought to be punished were taken off of us and put on Jesus. And the darkness that was supposed to come over us came over him. You understand that? Why that dark day is also a day of hope. Because Jesus, who was the richest, was plunged into injustice and darkness so that we could be set free. I'll just close with this statement of the Apostle Paul. And just ask this question, don't you know what grace is? This is what Paul said. He says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich." Do you understand grace? Do you get it? Do you receive it? I would say this, anyone who at some point comes to hear Jesus' voice and bows their knee and calls him Lord, if you get what it means to be saved by grace, if you get what it means to say, my father was a wandering Aramean and we were slaves and I was dead in my trespasses and sins, but by grace I've been made rich, then when you're walking down this road and at some point you say, wow, I've been blessed, there'll be no question what to do when someone says, help. It's a Christmas season, and I'd like to just call on our church. This Christmas, since the light of Christ has shone into our life, let us do whatever we can to shine that light to places of darkness. Let's do justice and seek God's grace together. Amen.